Hello everybody, this is Gregory with 5-Minute Catholic Apologetics, where 5 minutes of your time may get you to the divine. Today we're going to talk about a little biblical geography and talk about why the land of milk and honey, the land of the promised people, the promised land, was in present-day Israel. Now before we begin, let's start with a prayer. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritus Sancto, secutor in principio et nunc et semper et saecula saeculorum. Amen. Let me tell you, geography was my favorite subject as a kid. I knew every country's location and capital when I was 8. I love geography. So talking about biblical geography I find to be fun. We really don't have any episodes on biblical geography, and this probably will be the only one on biblical geography. But I thought it'd be fun to do a little episode on kind of the location of the Holy Land and why it was so important to put it there in terms of its ability to disperse the good news of Jesus Christ to the world. Now, I think most of you guys know where the Holy Land is. It's present-day Israel, and for most of its existence, it's been under the dominion of so many empires. I mean, going back to when Joshua brought the Israelites to the region, but more recently it was under Greek influence, and then later Roman Empire, and then much later the Byzantines, and then after that you can fast forward to the Ottomans, and then later to the UN mandate where the British owned it and then gave it to, or helped create the nation of Israel. But let's go back to Abraham. So Abraham's from the early Chaldeans. That's kind of Mesopotamia. He has this calling, as we read in Genesis, to come to what we would just call the Promised Land. Let's just call it the Holy Land. And he goes over there, and then we know his son and grandson, Jacob, are in that area. And then Jacob's kids have the whole Joseph of Egypt drama. We have an episode about submitting to God's will by looking at Joseph of Egypt. And then eventually they end up going to Egypt. Things work out well. Then they end up being slaves, of course. And then eventually Moses almost gets there and takes them back to the land flowing with milk and honey, which is the land of Canaan, which is now, of course, inhabited by other people. And then we know in the story of Judges and eventually in Kings that they overtake that area. And then later, how many prophets have to tell the two kingdoms once they split that they got to stop their iniquity? And then, God has a way of bringing us back through his own version of fraternal correction. They go to Babylon for exile, then eventually they come back with Ezra and Nehemiah, and then things are okay for a little while, and then wait, the Greeks come, and then wait, the Romans come, and then so forth. But my point is this. The Holy Land is at a very interesting location. And I think in this era of airplanes, I think we forget what antiquity was like. So antiquity, the boats were not the best, and the roads were pretty bad and always full of marauders and people that would steal your stuff. But the Holy Land is at a very unique position. It's between 3 continents. And I think sometimes we forget this. We think it's kind of like weird. It's tucked away in the Mediterranean. I keep up with soccer, and Israel is always part of the UEFA, the European Federation. I'm like, but they're not really European, but I guess they are. But it's in that strange region. But in ancient times, Egypt, even though this isn't peak Egypt, if you look around the time of Christ, for example, is still a very rich kingdom. It's controlled at this point by the Ptolemaics. Cleopatra's the last of the Ptolemies, which is a little, it's around the time of Jesus, a little around the time of Jesus, but it's still a very rich nation. And if you go certainly 1,000 years before that to the time of David, very rich, much richer. But the routes to go from Egypt to Rome or Greece, depending what century we're talking about, have to go through the Holy Land. They have to go. They're not going to go all the way around through Spain. I mean, no, they go through the Holy Land. So you have all the roads to and from Egypt going through the Holy Land. Then you have the roads, depending what century we're talking about, coming from Arabia. Arabia is mostly desert. We know Arabia kind of gets more of its fame 700 years later after the time of Christ with Muhammad. But there are people down there. There's a lot of spices. You see a lot of caravans. And the road from there to Europe again, have to go through the Holy Land, because the middle of that area, we call it the Fertile Crescent. So you see like Mesopotamia is pretty fertile, and then it goes around to kind of Syria into where Israel is at. But right east of Israel, where Jordan is, it's a little fertile, but then you go east of there, it's all desert, right? And then you go southwest, it's all desert. So again, roads have to go up to the Holy Land from there. Then you look at roads coming from peak Greece and later peak Rome, having to go to Egypt, we just talked about, have to go through the Holy Land. Then you look at roads that go from Europe, the routes that go from Greece and later Rome to Asia, because yes, there was trade, the Silk Road. They have to go through the Holy Land on the way through the Fertile Crescent, on the way to Egypt. Or on the way to Asia. So you see the Holy Land gets a lot of traffic. And so in many ways, it makes sense in terms of salvation history, why God would reveal himself to Abraham, why he would have him move there. I'm not saying this is why God moved him. I'm just saying that the Holy Land is a very strategic location if you want to spread something. Preferably not the plague, but you want to spread something. And so it makes sense that the Holy Land is a really good place to spread the news. It's exceedingly centrally located. And you can see this played out later on with Christ in Acts of the Apostles. Of course, at that time, they didn't know about the Americas. We didn't know about Australia. We certainly didn't know about Antarctica. We didn't really know. If you look at ancient maps, really Jerusalem was kind of the center of the world because we knew about Europe. We knew that Africa existed. We didn't know its southern extent, but certainly we knew about the northern part of Africa. And we knew most of the contours of Asia in ancient times. You think of someone like Ptolemy, not the Ptolemy of Alexander the Great's Ptolemy, who later ruled Egypt. His family ruled Egypt. But Ptolemy the geographer, you can see maps around Jesus' times where they kind of knew these three areas. And Jerusalem is perfectly located. It's right in the middle between Asia, Africa, Europe. And so when Christ's apostles come around and start spreading the news, we always think kind of like from the white European perspective, we think of Paul, we think of Peter, and how they went west. But we forget the other apostles. Matthew, we have an episode on the 12 apostles and how they got martyred after they added Matthias. How 11 of them got martyred. John, of course, didn't get martyred, but a lot of the other ones died in India, St. Thomas. You look at Matthew, he was in Ethiopia doing a mass. And then so forth. A lot of them went east to the Crimea, to Anatolia, to Armenia, to India. Again, east. And we always think west because we're Latin Catholics. But Jerusalem is perfectly centered to go in every direction. For example, if Jesus in salvation history brought out Abraham and early Chaldeans to Spain, or even worse, like Britannia, it'd be kind of hard to spread the message because you're stuck in this corner. But Jerusalem is perfectly located with these roads. And later, with shipping did get better around the time of Christ compared to like 1,000 years earlier with the time of David, where the shipping routes, we know that Paul, for example, did a lot of his four missionary tours. Some of it was by boat. We know his last one was by boat. And we know that shipping was pretty common. This is Pax Romana. This is peak Roman time. And so we know even in terms of shipping, it's a great place because you can hit pretty much all the Mediterranean. There were shipping routes that went down the Red Sea as well to get to India and so forth. So again, it's interesting how God plays these things really well in terms of where he locates things. And so he reveals himself essentially to Abraham and his descendants. And you see Old Testament really in kind of the scheme of salvation history. And look, I don't know God's will or anything like that for sure, but it does make sense that he picks the Holy Land because the Holy Land is centrally located and it's almost the ideal place to disperse the message of Jesus Christ eventually to every corner of the globe. Guys, post in the comments. Love to hear from you. Hit the notification, subscribe, and share button. Until next time, take care. God bless.